evening here in Orlando. But
so it's evening in.
exactly. It was a great conversation last time, and I know we still had a lot more topics. I mean, you can never exhaust these things, so it's great to be.
True. I have a feeling that if I pick even one topic, we're going to spend the whole time tearing it apart. So I did have a couple things I wanted to ask you at the beginning. I noticed, so you have children.
Yes, I do. Young children, even though I'm no spring chicken anymore, but it's one of those things, you know. So
well, I noticed it in a comment that you made on the Guy Sengstock video with Paul Vanderbilt.
Yes.
That you made a comment about the whole idea of circling, and that's something you do with your children almost every.
Well, it's not. No, I mean, yeah, I said in parentheses that maybe in spirit, not in the actual practice. In fact, I don't. You know, I'm only familiar with
Before you get started, hold on a second. I think a lot of people didn't get from that video exactly what Guy Sengstock meant by circling. So maybe you'd like to start with explaining what you thought he meant about circling.
I don't think I'm fully qualified to do that. I have a vague understanding, but you know, from watching a couple of the other videos he did with on other channels, but I don't think I can do a good job of explaining what it is. Obviously, it's a method for people to interact in a specific way, where you know they get to a level deeper than a regular conversation, where they somehow. But what I meant by my comment with my children is that when I interact with them, you know, obviously they're children, but it feels like it goes deeper than the regular conversation. You know, there is like an interaction that obviously I'm transferring, you know, some of my knowledge and, you know, culture, or, you know, some of my ideas to them. And they seem to get it. It's just, and it's not just verbal communication either. It's just, you know, the way they sit on my lap, or I read them a story, or, you know, the questions they ask. It seems like there's a deeper connection there somehow, which I thought might be somewhat similar to, but you know, I might be going into, you know, the speculation at that point. I thought, well, you know, from what he was talking about with Paul, I thought maybe there is, you know, a little bit of a connection. Maybe I'm making too much out of it. Maybe it's not.
No, I definitely think that's certainly a part of what he was talking about. And
right, I think it's part of it. But
yeah. I haven't done any research at all, but I did get the sense that he was talking about some kind of radical, intentional listening that is really seeking to kind of help the other person to unfold things that they're not even conscious are there.
Right.
And, what for me, one of the experiences that came to mind was a memory of, I don't know if you ever heard my first story when I talked to Paul, but I went through a period of time in 1 year where my husband left me. Well, the year before, my brother died in a plane crash. Then a year later, my husband left me. My father died, and my mother died, and then my father died, all in a 1 month period. And it was very hard to process any of that because there was so much at one time. And some months later, I was at a church service in Michigan, and a woman came up to me and asked me how I was doing. And I said, of course, I said, oh, I'm fine. And she put her arms around me to hug me. And all of a sudden, I just started sobbing. She said, I want you to come to my house. I think you need somebody to listen to you. And I had no idea what she was talking about, but it was an invitation, and I was in Michigan. I didn't know anybody else. So I thought, well, I'll take her up on it. So I went over there, and she told me her story and of how someone had listened to her some years before. And she began to listen to me. And she spent 5 hours drawing out of me things that I didn't even know were there. And it was such an amazing experience to have someone truly reflect back what she thought I might be feeling. Yeah, so it was that kind of radical listening. It really started a deep, deep healing for me. And I
Right,
think
and
that might be part of what he's talking about.
Sort of experienced, and I can't say I experienced this exactly. You already have to do it. I'd have to go to a session where they, actually do it, and
Hmm.
what the exact techniques are and things like that. But obviously, the mere principle of telling your story, particularly when you're in a bad spot, in a bad situation, and be able to tell the story to somebody is very, very powerful. I mean, of course, I've experienced that, but it's very, very helpful, to just keep it bottled up. And I tend to be that kind of personality where I don't necessarily like to talk about things to other people. There's things that bother me, but and then it just accumulates, and it's probably not that healthy. But on the other hand, sometimes I have talked to people about issues and problems, and yeah, it made a big difference.
Hmm.
So but I definitely I don't feel comfortable talking about circling because I don't have the expertise and I've never done it. So
Well,
I'm
it gave me a
kind of
little insight into
imagining. I
you.
have a
It
yeah.
gave me a little insight into you and your children. I thought
Yes.
it was a very precious picture.
I just have a very deep connection with them somehow. They're very, very precious to me. I have a girl, a boy, and a girl. So.
Hmm.
And the youngest one is just 4.5 years old. So.
Oh my goodness. I miss those days. I do.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, my
Yeah, I
youngest.
know. That's why I want to enjoy those days because I know they won't be there forever. So,
Mhm.
um, it's these times. My oldest daughter is, she's only 9 years old too, so she's still on an age where, she's maturing, but she'll still play with dolls and things like that. And I know it's not gonna last. I know. Just in a very few years, it's gonna change. So I'm kind of, really appreciating the current time of their lives now, and we have a great time.
Wise man.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
at a certain age, hopefully, you do learn things in life. So I think children, if people, this meaning crisis, I don't know if it works for everybody. To me, my children give me a lot of meaning. I mean, right there, just that. I don't need to search very far for meaning. Uh,
Hmm.
I know it's probably not true for everyone, but I think it's true for a lot of people. And so, yeah, I don't have a meaning crisis. I have plenty, making sure my children have, that have a future and that they are safe and comfortable and that they learn um, good people and good citizens is plenty of meaning for me right there.
Well, that's sort of an illustration of what Jordan Peterson always talks about, that when you take on a weight of responsibility,
Right.
it provides meaning in your life. And being a dad to 3 children is a weight of
Right.
responsibility.
Right. It's one, of course there are many other responsibilities that one can take, but I do think Jordan Peterson is exactly right on this. It's the meaning, the crisis of meaning to me is more of a crisis of like people have been they've been relieved of the burden of a lot of responsibilities that they used to have. I think part of it, and I don't want to get political, but a lot of it is the welfare state and the fact that things have gotten too easy for too many people, and so giving, and Jordan Peterson has emphasized this many times in his talks, is just giving things or money to people is not going to make them happy. The only way to be happy is to actually earn it, to do something. Just like our in Professor Vervaeke's terminology, there's the mode of being versus the mode of having, and having things is cool. But what's even cooler is actually, I guess you could, I would call it the mode of doing as opposed to the mode of being, although I guess the two could be thought of as equivalent. Being a creator, let's say, is doing something. So you could say doing and being are interchangeable, perhaps, or you could distinguish them. But anyway, the mode of doing things is very, very important. That's, to me, like the journey is the destination. I think there's a lot of truth in that. once you've accomplished something, a lot of time you say, wow, that was great. And then, pretty soon you say, okay, well, now I have this. And actually what I'm craving for now is the next adventure or the next project, the next, because I want to start doing things again. The satisfaction is not so much in having the thing in the end, although there's satisfaction to be had with that. But the satisfaction is more in the fact that you created something, you did something. So you participated in something, you were active. That's where you get your meaning, to me. I don't think it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, I still love Professor Verbeek. There's a lot of truth in everything he says. I really love, I always watch his lectures. And a lot of the things, because of course I'm also very interested in the cognitive science aspect of it. But I think in many ways the meaning crisis is a lot simpler than a lot of people think. It's just people are being given so much, that they don't know how to express themselves or in doing something, because it's all been handed out to them. So they say, well, what next? What do I do?
Well, and that gets complicated on so many levels. I mean,
yes, it is it's very complex.
Yeah, it sounds simple until you start thinking, well, yes, it's partly, let's say, welfare may be one of the problems, handing out money to people, but another problem is, I mean, we've certainly seen this in our lives, that because we both started out, my husband and I both started out with very little, but over time we've managed to, thrive and have a good life, and now we've been able to give our child too much. And so it makes it very difficult for our child to see the necessity of putting forth the kind of effort that we had to put forth to get where we are. We see that all across the society.
You just don't appreciate the things you have unless you as much. Well, you do. You might appreciate them. Somebody gives you something, you might be very grateful, but you don't appreciate it as much as when you actually work for it yourself, or create it yourself, or or participate in the construction or the building or the creation of something. I think that's a lot more meaningful. Right? Just being handed something, okay, it's great. I mean, when it's a personal relationship, like a personal gift from somebody that cares for you and you care about them, that's one thing, and then you can get a lot of meaning from that. But when it's completely impersonal, it's just government taking your money and handing it to whoever you don't know who it is. You have no idea. And these people don't get it, and they have no idea who it came from. It came from, as far as they're concerned, it came from the sky, or
that's funny, magic money.
It's just there, right? So
well, I wonder how far we could roll this back too. I mean, could you roll it all the way back to when things had to be made using physical labor?
Right.
It was way more meaningful on a daily basis than when we can make something with talking an idea into a computer, and we've made
right.
something.
Well, it goes back to Paul has pointed this out, and many other people have, but there seems to be a correlation between the loss of meaning and how rich a society is, right? Mm-hmm. You would think, and Paul said this because he's been a missionary in very poor countries, and from what I understand, he said, well, there was no meaning crisis there. People had nothing, but they didn't have time to worry about a meaning crisis. Their meaning was to try to make a living day to day and survive the next week.
Well, it even goes deeper than that, because I spent a month in Haiti.
Yes, and, that's
and back at a time, and I think that was even when it was worse than it is now, if that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
When Baby Duvalier was the dictator there. And yet these Christians would come to church. They'd walk 10 miles on bare feet over the mountaintops to get to the church. And they would be so filled up with joy. And they would invite us to their home for lunch. And we'd walk back up over the mountains and go to their home. And their home consisted of a little a little hut made of 4 boards and a few pieces of cardboard. And they had a little open fire outside over which they would cook something. And they delighted in sharing it with us. And they were just so gracious and loving and caring. I mean, it just makes you sob with deep humility over the wisdom of these people who have absolutely nothing. And then, of course, we came back to Florida. And after we landed, there's some story on TV about this this woman who's not getting enough welfare to have her own house.
Yeah.
She has to live with her mother, you know, and I'm...
Right, so it gives you a perspective. Yeah, I've been to very poor country. The poorest country I've been to is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I used to go work there quite a bit, quite a few years ago. About, 7, 8 years ago. And the Congo is, it's probably similar to Haiti. I mean, of course, and even then I was in the capital, Kinshasa, which actually is not the worst part of the country as far as that's concerned. But still, it was quite an education to go there. That's not the only. I've traveled to many countries when I was in the Air Force or an Air Force contractor. And it does give you an appreciation, though. You do appreciate what you have a lot more after you come back from these countries. You're grateful. It does give you a sense of appreciation. I've also been in a situation where I had nothing to eat. I mean, that was only because, it was things like Air Force Survival School. So it was artificial. So in that sense, I knew after a few days it would end. So it wasn't like this. I can't compare that to really being a real starvation, part of the world where, like the Darfur or whatever, where people already. So I'm not making that comparison at all. But all I say is, on a very small scale, I appreciated the food I had afterwards a lot more than before, right? So if you don't eat for a few days, you already appreciate it a lot more. And it's just, it's common. I'm not saying anything extraordinary here. I think everybody can relate to that. But our society has become so rich, and Paul's pointed this out also many times. We're so affluent that in many ways we've lost a sense of perspective, and that's probably also contributes to the meaning crisis. I think meaning crisis is manifold. I didn't mean to oversimplify and say it's just because of welfare. No, not at all. To me, that's just one aspect. But the loss of personal face-to-face communications is a huge deal. The families have scattered all over because of work necessities, and so when families, extended families, grandparents, the uncles, aunts, all lived in the same village and saw each other on a regular basis, it was very different than now. As soon as you finish high school, basically you depart for college, and already that's it. You're physically separated from the rest of your family, probably for the rest of your life, except for intermittent occasional visits and things like that. That's also has a big impact on people's lives and meaning and everything, because I think you need this. You need interaction with people you love and that you care for and that care for you. So again, that's yet another aspect of the meaning crisis to me. So how it's very complex. Yes.
How would you say that you went about developing your own philosophy of life? And the reason I'm asking you is that I went back over our earlier conversation, and because I was trying to understand. I mean, you say you're not a materialist, you're not a reductionist, and yet you can't accept the idea of God, but you do believe that religion is necessary for moral behavior. And it's so I'm wondering how you put that all together, and how you see it going, because I'm having a hard time understanding your philosophy in general.
Yeah, well, it's not common. It's not a common philosophy. On the other hand, I think I've been able to, for me anyway, for my own sake, to answer questions that have been asked since the ancient Greek philosophers and are still not answered, which is a source of immense frustration to me. So in some cases, it's understandable. I mean, science evolves, and there are a lot of things we know now that we didn't know 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or even 10 years ago. But to me, I think I have some answers that are very uncommon. People are not used to it, and so when they're confronted with what I say, they're like, "Wait a second, I can't even relate to it." It's these ideas are different, right? Than the standard approaches that people have heard over and over again. So, for example, I reject the dichotomy, or the binary choice between a purely materialistic or physicalist world and a supernatural, or a world that necessitates the intervention of the supernatural, right? So to me, there is an in between. There is and we talked about this before, because this all comes from my study of complexity theory and emergent properties and things like that. I think you can explain why there are things in the world that are not material or not physical, and in the sense that they're not reducible to the description of the physical universe, and yet they're not supernatural in the sense that they still require a physical substrate to exist, right? So something can be more than the sum of its parts, but if you get rid of the parts, it disappears. So I try to have a naturalist, what I call a naturalist approach to, as opposed to a purely physicalist approach to the world. So I like natural explanations.
Where does it start? I mean, I understand you're talking about the in-between part, when complexity allows things to emerge from...
Yeah, like consciousness, for one, which is the most important emergent property in the universe, right?
But that's emerging after things have been rolling for a while. So
correct. Now, as far as where it starts, okay. So at the very beginning, how did the universe came to being? I just don't know. Obviously we all know about the Big Bang, and I've heard many debates. William Lane Craig, will talk about Sir Roger Penrose's theory and how he disagrees with them and things like that. And you can go in circles over and over again on that. It's not something that concerned me a whole lot, to tell you the truth. It doesn't bother me not to know how the universe came into being. Right? I'm quite comfortable saying that there are things I don't know, and just because I don't know, I don't have to make up some explanation just to satisfy my peace of mind. It doesn't bother me. No, maybe that's just a personal psychological trait, that I'm comfortable with uncertainty. So maybe that's not for everyone. I have no problem with that. Everybody's different, but one thing I want to say, that in a slight correction to something you said before, you said that I believe that religion is necessary. I'm not sure that's true. I do think religion has been very useful. I'm kind of cautious on this.
Say useful?
Sorry, go ahead.
Did you say useful or neutral?
No, useful, positive, in a positive way, right? Okay. So the people like the Sam Harrises and the celebrity atheists, Richard Dawkins, all these people that come out and say, I guess maybe the one that actually said it more forcefully was the late Christopher Hitchens, right, who wrote the book God is Not Great, and, how religion poisons. I think the subtitle was How Religion Poisons Everything, or something like that. But anyway, but obviously I absolutely do not subscribe to that view. No, that's completely wrong. Mm-hmm. And also, that it's like, for example, Steven Pinker is a lot more polite about it. and he's a little bit more open-minded. But his latest book on the Enlightenment, Enlightenment Now, and Paul has discussed this book, and a few other commentators on his channel and subordinate channels have also discussed this, that the Enlightenment was not, as Pinker would have it, a reaction against Christianity. Actually, it's a result of Christianity, right? So that's the way I see it. I've read, if you read the history books, that's something that kids, unfortunately, are not taught in school, but the impact, because basically, it's, the story goes, well, they were the ancient Greek philosophers, and then there was, Christendom started, and then there were the Middle Ages that are basically called the Dark Ages, because it was the religion, and Christian religion in particular, was basically squashing all knowledge, on purpose. And of course, it culminates, of course, this is after the Middle Ages, but at the time of Renaissance, the story of Galileo and his treatment by the Catholic Church and all that. And there's a lot of untruths in everything that has been told. It's just almost ridiculous. I mean, it's a caricature, not even close to the truth as to what happened. I mean, the real truth is science. We probably wouldn't have science if it weren't for a bunch of Catholic monks during the Middle Ages actually doing a lot of research on their own and finding all kinds of stuff, right? And a lot of it resulted from the fact that we talked about God one and God two, and I do believe in God one. The natural law, the natural order of the universe, the logos. Is that part of Christianity? There is that aspect of God, right? So there is this order that can be discovered, and that is comprehensible to a rational mind, right? That one of the characteristics of humanity is this capability for reason, right? So the fact that the universe had a given order that created by God, if you want, that's fine. We can say. To me, it's this abstract God that stands for precisely the order of the universe that is understandable, although probably not understandable in its totality, but we can at least get glimpses of certain aspects of how the world works through inquiry, through rational inquiry and science, and asking questions and doing experiments. And a lot of that stuff was done by people who were very devout Christians. They were monks, in monasteries here and there. Fair amount of some of these tended to be very intelligent and very inquisitive, and they went out and said, "Okay, how does the world work?" And they made huge progress in areas such as astronomy and biology and physics and all kinds of things. And these were very religious people. So this story that people are told that that religion was anti-knowledge, anti-science, the caricature was Galileo, being basically, the Inquisition, and it wasn't even that bad. I mean, all the Pope was asking him to do was to admit that his theory of, the Earth going around the sun, the heliocentric, was only a theory and it wasn't quite proven yet, right? And Galileo said, "No, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say, no, it's the proven truth, right?" And that's what called the world, but and you can argue that, okay, perhaps it wasn't the best way to handle things, and we do it a little different way, but this caricature that the church was anti-science and wanted to, prolong the Dark Ages is just beyond ridiculous. I don't accept that. It's wrong. So the question now is, and on the other hand, I do see that religion actually provided a moral grounding for people that that they didn't necessarily have before, and particularly the Christian religion. Now, you could argue any religion does this to some extent. So what makes Christianity stand out, particularly Catholicism? I'm not a Catholic. I've attended Catholic mass. I'm not religious. I don't go to church, but I have gone to church even pretty recently because I do have many friends who are religious, and they invite me to go, and I say sure, I'll go. You never know what will happen, who you're going to meet and what you're going to learn. And so I don't have a problem with that. And my children have gone to church too, and they don't go regularly, but I want them to be exposed to ideas. They can make up their mind later. The fact is that Christianity, the one concept that to me stood out, particularly from the New Testament, was I think was a brand new idea at the time, was the idea of the dignity and worth of every single individual, regardless of who they were. It didn't matter whether you were a slave, you were a woman, a man, that you were black, white, it didn't matter. You in the eye of God, in the eyes of God, you were worthy of His love, and that you had dignity as a human being, and this applied to everybody with no exceptions. That, as far as I know, that was something completely new in the world. The Greeks didn't think that way. Mm-hmm. They argue, there might have been some particular cases of the lesser known, sophist philosophers, and I hear that might have written or said something that might give an inkling of the same kind of things. I mean, even in ancient Greece, some of the philosophers, not Plato, Socrates, or all these people pretty much accepted the idea of slavery. But there were apparently other philosophers of the time that at least questioned, whether slavery was moral or was the right thing to do. But nevertheless, I think Christianity is what made prominent this idea of the worth of every single individual in and of themselves, right? Mm-hmm. They did not need a king, an earthly king or an earthly authority to bestow upon them dignity and worth. That just the fact that they were born and as a human, you had that worth automatically. That to me, that's something that completely revolutionized the way people started thinking. Now, it took a long time; it took centuries, for it to fully establish itself. And I think it culminated precisely in the Enlightenment.
So where do you think that idea came from?
It would never have happened without Christianity.
Where do you think that idea came from?
The idea of the worth of
the worth of the individual, the dignity of the individual.
No, that's what Jesus Christ taught.
Okay, but where did he?
You're right. No, where did he get the idea? Yeah, I mean that's a good question, and that's something that you do have to think about. And if somebody tells me it was divine inspiration in the sense that because he's the Son of God, obviously he knew. I say fair enough. To me, because I tend to prefer naturalistic explanations. It's like, okay, well, there's no question to me that historically Christ was a historical figure, so. And you can argue about the details of what was reported about, his activities and actions and his teachings. But nevertheless, here we are, somehow that idea that of the dignity of every single individual, took a hold of history, so to speak, and grew and grew and grew and grew. And now it's taken for granted. Now it's taken for granted.
I think it's what C.S. Lewis calls the good infection.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it was a virtuous circle, And so to just say, like Pinker, that there was the bad religious times, and then suddenly the Enlightenment, the philosophers suddenly emerged and rejected all this stuff, and somehow now we know better and we're gonna get over it. And it's like, no, that's like so simplistic, and it's just wrong, you know. Now, on the other hand, though, I must say this. Now, so there's another side of that coin, because I do think now, post-Enlightenment, Christianity did change in the light of the Enlightenment, so to speak. You know, I mean, it sounds like a pun, but so I think we did see some changes. I mean, not in the fundamental aspects. Again, you know, that the respect the dignity of the individual, and that you know, you should try. I mean, there are many teachings that, you know, the Ten Commandments are the Ten Commandments. I mean, this, you know, it didn't change any of that stuff. But I think it did change. In a way, I think it made Christians more Christians. In a sense that, for a while, you know, I mean, many Christians did at least try. You know, we're all human, so we're all fallible, and so, you know, we're all sinful in that sense. But you know, some Christians kind of lost track of the true meaning of Christianity, right? It's like things like forgive your enemies, and you know, when I say that, personally, I know there are limits to that, so you can't take that completely literally. That's to me, that's it's not a, you know, a rational view of things. But you know, the wars of religions were a real thing. I mean, you know, the Saint Bartholomew massacre in France. You know, I went to high school in France, and we learned about this. And you know, when the Catholics went out and massacred literally entire families of Protestants just because they were Protestants for no other reason. In some cases, these were people that had known each other for a long time. And the same thing happens with, you know, in the Arab world, where you know, some fundamentalist Islamists, you know, I mean, resort to violence and you know, things. So, but it has happened in the Christian world as well. We cannot deny this. This is something that has to be faced, right? So I think in a way, the Enlightenment was also a reaction to that. You know, they said, well, there's got to be a better way to get along, right? We've had some issues. It's even within Christianity. You know? I mean, there were issues, you know, the Crusades, which is another, oh, by the way, as an aside, another falsification of history. You know, this rail, the bad Christians going to kill the Muslims. I'm saying, come on, please. That is so ridiculous. But anyway, I don't want to get onto a tangent too much. But the fact is, I think the secular philosophers that were part of the Enlightenment also, I think, in a way, are reminded actual Christians, you know, the people that went to church and practiced Christianity, of some of the, you know, it's kind of ironic in a way, but I think they reminded the Christians of some of the Christian values that they should have followed the whole time, but had a little bit forgotten, you know, in some ways. So,
well, I think one of the things that happened around that time as well was the idea that more and more people could read the Word of God in their own language. And
well, that's Reformation too.
Yeah, and were encouraged to read the Word of God in their own language, and
right.
It wasn't withheld from them, or they weren't being convinced that they were unable to understand it for themselves or to interpret it for themselves.
Right.
And
well, the Reformation was the big thrust, you know, that because the Bible was the you know, the source of knowledge, and then the idea was, well, we don't need anybody to interpret the Bible for us. Each individual must do that for themselves, which meant that, oh yeah, by the way, we have to translate the Bible in people's language so they can actually read it for themselves and be the final judge of what it tells them. That's the whole idea of the Reformation. And of course, then there were different interpretations within that tradition. You know, so we had the Lutherans first, and I'm, you know, on my father's side, I'm a Lutheran. That's why officially, you know, my patriarchal tradition. And my dad was not like a very devout Lutheran, but he did go to church on a regular basis, and I've gone to Lutheran services with him many times. He was from Estonia, and Estonia basically has a Lutheran tradition, overall. That's the majority of religion there. So I'm quite familiar with that. In fact, I did my confirmation, on Lutheran tradition when I was 19 years old. So I went, I did Bible study, I did all that stuff. But he never. I'm a very curious individual, so I had no issues going through it and learning and see. So maybe, who knows? Maybe I will have a revelation, gain the faith, and and see the light. But I didn't, not in that sense. So what can you do? It's maybe I think some of it is personality driven. I've done the Jordan Peterson, the personality assessment, trace and all that. So I have an idea of what makes me tick in a way. I mean, nobody does 100%. Obviously, we can't know ourselves completely. And I think it was Paul I was saying, a lot of time we know, other people know us better than we know ourselves. There's a lot of truth to that. But to some extent, that depends on how introspective an individual is. Right? Some people have no capacity for self-introspection whatsoever. It's almost pathological. And some people have almost too much introspection. They constantly worried about how they will appear to other people and if their actions. I mean, that's too bad. So you have to have the right middle, right? I'm very Aristotelian in that sense. I'm a very big believer in having the right balance. Reaching for the middle of not be at one extreme or the other of just about anything in life. There might be some exceptions, but that's something. But in general, I try to balance things, so you're not extreme. But again, none of us know ourselves 100%. In fact, it's logically impossible. But in general, though, I know my personality is very irrational compared to most people. I'm very, very irrational to the point that I'm so rational that I understand at least I think I understand the limits of rationality. Which I think some people that think of themselves as rational are not really irrational. I think that people like Sam Harris strike me as people who are exactly in the Jonathan Haidt mold. Jonathan Haidt's work. I don't know if you read his book, but
I did not.
Like The Righteous Mind. But you've heard the metaphor of the elephant, the emotional elephant, doing what it wants, and then the rider being the rational aspect of human being, just being along for the ride, and then coming up with rationalistic or explanations for what their emotions did and what the elephant did. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. But again, that's very, it varies a lot from individual to individual. Some people are more emotional.
I'd like to jump in on that for just a second and take that idea back to what you said was the big hinge point at when Jesus Christ offered the truth that there is a sacred value to each individual, and where that idea came from. Because it seems to me you cannot derive that idea rationally.
Well, actually, you can, but it's a very complicated system. And at the time, though, you can now. I mean, this is not necessarily going to be something I can only cover it in very broad overview. But that's I think we might have mentioned this. There's now that we know enough about complex adaptive systems, we know enough about self-referential system. We know a lot about game theory. We know a lot about systems control theory, and the two go together. I didn't mention game theory on our last conversation, but that's also something that's very, very important to understand. Why you would want to treat individuals as individuals. You can actually make sense of it from a scientific point of view. Now, you can today, but 2,000 years ago, though, yeah, I don't know. That's
I'm not saying that it's not true.
They did not have that knowledge 2,000 years ago. So.
Yes, all of those things that you're talking about illustrate to us how it is true, but they don't tell us how it could be derived from the place that people were at 2,000 years ago.
Correct. That's right. 2,000 years ago, it is, I admit, it's a mystery to me how people, now, it is mysterious in some way, but of course, one of the facts about cultural evolution is that it can actually, what John Vervaeke, he talks about distributed cognition. To me, that's a very critical concept. It's an immensely powerful concept. Our culture is way, way more, orders of magnitude more powerful than any of us, singular, can even dream of being. We're nothing compared to the knowledge that's contained and embodied in our culture. And that knowledge represents centuries and millennia of learning. Unfortunately, that's a learning that comes the hard way. It's learning that's been bought by, in many cases, the deaths. The people dying for their ideas because their ideas turn out to be not so good, right? So hopefully, by slowly weaning out the bad ideas, we get closer and closer to the good ideas, right? So that's the whole idea of cultural evolution versus biological evolution. And actually, it's not one versus the other, it turns out. In fact, I was gratified to see Paul. He didn't really talk much about the book. He mentioned it in one of his recent talks. I can't remember which one was it. It was, but anyway, on the thumbnail on his YouTube video, he had several things on there, but he had a picture of the cover of the book, The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Henrich, which I think is one of the greatest books ever written if you want to understand how the world really works. Far, far superior to Sapiens by Yuval Harari, which is another book that Paul's mentioned, not that much recently, but in the past, which I think is overly simplistic and not. There's some interesting ideas in there. I don't reject it. I've read the book, so. But then later on I read the Secret of Our Success, and far better if you want to actually learn something. And what it deals with mostly is how powerful the role of culture is. So the distributed cognition. Mm-hmm. Some people think, we need to work on it's the next step in human evolution, distributed cognition. So linking people together, with AI system and blending in. And there is already some people point out, well, our cell phones are sort of a form of distributed cognition. So distributed cognition is nothing new. It's not something that just arrived on the scene with the advent of computers and cell phones. No, it's been going on for millennia and millennia and millennia. It's called culture, right? So that's how each one of us is a recipient and beneficiary of the learning of our ancestors, in a way. It's all very, very, very complex. It's so complex that we cannot distinguish anymore clearly between biological evolution and cultural evolution. Now, those two operate separately, but they also operate together. So there's this thing called gene-culture coevolution, which is a huge theme in that book. And so there's an interaction between cultural novelty and our subsequent biological development. And one of the the greatest examples of that is the domestication of fire by humans at some point in ancient history. And one of the aspects of the domestication of fire, and being able to actually control fire and build fires and learn how to make a fire, led at some point to the beginning of the cooking of foods. So, people way back must have eaten just raw things, including raw meat, perhaps. When they would hunt, they ate raw meat, like some animals obviously do still today. And people point out occasionally, say, well, see, that proves that we should all be vegetarians because our digestive tract and our teeth structure and our jaw muscles and, our biology is not adapted to eat meat. They always think of raw meat when they think about that. And that's absolutely 100% true. We're not adapted to eat raw meat. What we are adapted to is eat cooked meat. And that, cooking food was a cultural invention. And that cultural invention, 50,000 years ago, whenever it was, actually subsequently caused the modification of human biology. That's amazing to think about it. It's really amazing. But that's true. And that's not the only example. There's a bunch of other examples in the book. And it's a very, very powerful way to understand the world and how, without knowing it, we are all, we should all be grateful for everybody that's lived before us and the knowledge. And again, that's not perfect knowledge. It has its faults. And that's when, people will reject because they find a flaw in that cultural ancestral knowledge, and so they say, well, it's not perfect, so we have to reject it completely out of hand and start from zero. Just forget everything that we've learned. Teenagers tend to do that. Teenagers don't. They when they reach a certain age, they're like, I don't want to hear it. I know better than everybody else. It's just a phase, though. Eventually, they grow out of it. But some people apparently never grow out of it. They stay like that their entire life, and that's why I'm a conservative. But just because of this. Now, a conservative, that can mean many things, but in the sense that I recognize and I respect the fact that there's this entire body of knowledge that we have that is embodied in our culture that it is very dangerous to just throw out in the garbage can. You can't do that. In fact, Jordan Peterson says this all the time, right? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you can be too conservative and reject all novelty, which is also a flaw. You can't be conservative to that extreme. Mm-hmm. So we have to be able to adapt to changing environments and circumstances. So we can't be overly rigid, and reject all novelty. But all it means is that we should be cautious, and we certainly should not completely reject what our parents and our grandparents and our ancestors and our communities have taught us. That we might be, we might question some of the things, but you just say, let's forget all this and start from scratch, which has been, something that's happened over and over in history, particularly, of course, in the 20th century. We saw the, absolute disaster that rejection of the wisdom of our ancestors led to, in communism and Nazism. They were a complete rejection of that ancestral knowledge, which, oh, by the way, incorporates the Judeo-Christian. It's to me, it's not 100% the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it's the Judeo-Christian values play a huge role in that culture in the West. In the Occidental, what we call the Western culture.
Well, so let me take that idea of distributed cognition and put that together with what you're talking about in terms of conservative thought. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming that you would say that the distributed cognition idea would be a parallel to the distributed decision-making of the free market.
Yes, right. I mean,
Would
Correct.
you like to comment on that at all in terms of Friedrich?
No, it's one of the aspects. It's one of the aspects of, okay, but say that, so, yeah, so yeah, we have to be careful how we distinguish things. It's amazingly enough, if I'm going to show you how much of a nonconformist I am, I describe myself as a conservative liberal. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It does. Are you talking classical liberal?
Yes.
Okay.
So to me, people, and of course, in everyday life, they oppose, there's conservatives versus liberals. That's just an American thing, though. Liberal in Europe, for example, still means classical liberal. So they don't have quite the same. But no, conservative is more opposed to progressive. Somebody that wants to just radically change the world now. They don't have the patience. So we need to change things according to my view of things. And so I think that would be somebody that calls themselves a progressive. So conservative is opposed to progressive. Liberal is opposed to authoritarian. Or you could also, because I kind of associate liberalism with individualism. I don't think you can have one without the other. So you could also oppose it to collectivist, philosophy or ideology. So liberalism in that sense, liberal/individualism is opposed to a authoritarian or collectivist ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, authoritarian and collectivism are not the same thing, but they do, they are related. So that's where I come from. And again, I don't really wish to talk politics, but I think there is, to me, that's. But if you want to understand how I think and how I came to think about these things, it's pretty important, because you are right. One of the what you mentioned about the economic aspects of the things are more have less to do with conservatism than the liberal part of that equation,
Mm-hmm.
right? That
it goes back into that far back tradition of how our markets have been established and how our economic systems have been established.
That they are, in Hayek's terms, they are the result of human action, but not human design. Like no single entity designed the free market. It just came into being from spontaneous interaction of various. Now, of course, in the modern world, it is, well, at least in theory, it is preserved by laws and things, that come from the top, in a way, from government. But all these laws are supposed to do is make sure that there's no interference with that individual to individual interaction. Of course, in practice now we've moved far away from that in many areas, right? There's like, well, in my opinion, far too much government intervention in the market. But okay, that's a different story.
It especially becomes a problem when the intervention is on behalf of one group over against another, rather than allowing the distributed cognition to operate the way it's supposed to.
Right, exactly. You want to let people who have the information be able to use that information in a way they see appropriate. And that also goes to Nassim Taleb's idea of skin in the game, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the idea that people will be a lot more responsible with their actions when they have something to lose if they take the wrong action, right? There's far too many people in modern society that are able to get away with making decisions or doing things in which they don't suffer the consequences of their actions. And that's absolutely terrible. And that goes back to the systems control theory thing, that when you have a system, the feedback mechanisms in a system are very, very important. So, you can have positive feedback loops, you can have negative feedback loops, you can have all kinds of different configurations. And in some cases, if you don't have the system have the right kinds of feedback loops, it can actually destroy the entire system. The typical example of a positive feedback loop is when, for example, somebody speaks into a microphone that's too close to the speakers, right? So you get that very loud squeal because the system feeds back on itself. The microphone picks up what you say, and then it feeds back the speakers, what comes out of the speakers feedback in the microphone, and it goes into this loop that amplifies itself to the point where all you can hear is the squeal as opposed to your voice, right? So that's an example of a positive feedback loop which reinforces itself to the point of destruction. In some cases, in this case, of course, it doesn't really destroy the system physically, but there are cases where you can't destroy the system physically. It'll have catastrophic consequences on the system. On the other hand, there are negative feedback loops which actually tend to dampen the initial deviation from the norm, right? So you have a system that's basically autopilot, let's say, so it's basically feeding back on itself. It's autopoietic, maybe in the sense that John Vervaeke uses it, although I don't want to get into the uses of that term, but autocatalytic or autopoietic, anyway, it controls itself, right? So a system that contains its own control laws, so it can keep acting in the world. Typically those systems need some kind of feedback mechanism so they don't go out of control, right? So they tend to be based more, not exclusively, but more on negative feedback loops. So if there's a deviation from the norm, the feedback loop will tend to bring back the system to its equilibrium status, right? So that's very simplistic explanation, but I don't have time to explain it. But so these concepts are very, very important when you talk about society and the kinds of incentives. When you translate this into human terms, then you start talking about incentives, right? So do you have incentives that will keep people, maintaining a stable and orderly society? Or do you suddenly have perverse incentives that tend to destroy the society from the inside because people get into these feedback loops where, in everyday colloquial terms, what we tend to talk about are vicious circles, for example. I'm sure everybody's heard that term before. So that's kind of like the regular, I guess, popular culture view of what a feedback loop might be. It's a vicious circle. Something that once it started gets worse and worse and worse and worse until the time it breaks or something happens. In self-referential systems like the human world, we do have some options to get out of this, but that's only because we can recognize that something bad is happening, right? So if you have a self-referential system, you do have that escape potentially. It's not a given.
Potentially, yeah. So
you are able to reflect on the fact that, well, wait a second, this doesn't seem to be working the way we thought it would, right? So you have this negative feedback loop, and these incentives are creating all kinds of, that's, again, in everyday life, I'm sure everybody listening to this video has heard the term of unintended consequences, right? That's a very
big... and so here we are again, we have the meaning crisis, which is
right, unintended consequences.
Macroscopic picture of that.
Right.
So I want to take your idea of the liberal that you're talking about, your definition of liberal. And when I think of that, I'm also thinking of the idea of liberty or freedom.
Yes.
Right? Individuality. And it reminds me of one of the things Guy Sengstock said in his discussion with Paul, which I thought was just so deeply powerful, amazing, food for thought, definitely. I thought we might discuss this just a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I'll discuss anything.
Okay. It takes all of your freedom to deeply obey something.
Yes, I think there's a lot of truth to this.
So there was a comment that someone made on the video. Carlos Miranda made this comment. We often pit freedom and obedience against each other, but only because we misunderstand obedience as being the same thing as coercion or oppression.
No, that's right. Literally, if you were completely unfree, let's say, you were completely coerced by some higher authority to act in a certain way and you can only act that way, there's no meaning to obedience then. I mean, there's no sensible way you can say you're obeying that authority. You're just following, you're forced to do what they do because they are coercing you in some kind of physical way, whether it's, they implanted electrodes in your brain or they're, physically forcing you to do something, but you're not obeying. Yeah, obeying something implies the ability to not obey, right? The theoretical capacity to do otherwise. So you obey it because you want to. I agree with that.
So I'm going to put that together with another biblical statement that I think is deeply true.
Yes. Well,
okay.
I will never disagree with you that there are a lot of things in the Bible that are deeply true. That is not a point of contention with me.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the Ten Commandments are deeply true. I mean, and is there a lot you could list the examples? I don't know, maybe not ad infinitum, but you could list a lot of them. So.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we're still on the word obey, which I think is
yes, that's right. So go ahead.
Into the idea of liberal. To obey is better than sacrifice.
Is better than sacrifice?
Yeah, that's what God says. This is what God tells his people in the Old Testament. He says to obey is better than sacrifice.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, honestly, I don't know exactly what that means exactly.
Well, what it got me to
I would have to think about it.
What it got me to thinking about is that when it uses that word sacrifice in context, and of course context is always everything. The context is the obligatory sacrifices that the people of Israel were to carry out.
Right. Okay, in that sense.
Different purposes. Sometimes for
sacrificing an animal or something like that.
Sometimes for intended sins, sometimes for unintended sins. There were various reasons that sacrifices were to be carried out. But the Lord said to them that to obey is better than sacrifice. So I was trying to think about it, and I thought, well, okay, sacrifice is carried out to sacrifice in this sense is carried out to fulfill an obligation. It's a duty. It's something that you do because you've been told to do it, or because it pleases other people if you do it, or it makes you look good if you do it, or you get some sort of credit if you do it. Right. But to obey is something that has to come out of radical freedom, like you were saying.
Yes, I agree with that.
So if you think of it in terms of particle physics, the gal that was talking about particle physics, where you remove all the space until you get the particles into a place where there is no longer any space, and they're completely, they have no space around them. They will self-organize into a crystalline form, and they are now solid, and there's no new information there. Very, very low information entropy. They're crystallized, and all opportunity of newness and information is gone because there's no space. But if you
there's no freedom there.
Right, you give back the space, now things begin to move. Okay. Now I
need freedom. The only thing, the only word.
Just let me finish.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Here's my table. Here's my hand. These things are made up of particles that are seemingly quite free to be moving around wherever they want to move around. But because they're hitting each other in a certain pattern, I have a hand instead of just a bunch of particles floating there, right? So those particles are obeying some system, some form of law.
In this case, they are obeying your will, right? Your consciousness, your brain.
Well, the table here is not obeying my will. It's just.
That's right. It's not conscious.
But it is still particles. It is still only solid because those particles are hitting each other in a certain pattern.
Yes.
Right. So those particles are free They could be floating around in the air if they wanted to. They're not constrained by anything, but they happen to be hitting each other in a particular way to make this cable.
They're constrained by the laws of physics. I mean,
there you go.
We're constrained by by the natural law, the laws of physics being part of that, but there's a lot more. When we talk
so somehow they're obeying
complexity of the human world, then the laws are far, far, far more complex than that. I mean, unbelievably complex. We're starting.
I mean, if you look at the n-body problem, just looking at gravity, but if you take the n-body problem and magnify that out to all the different constants and all the different.
And that's my understanding is that Henri Poincaré, which who's a hero of Sibylla King, because he's mentioned specifically in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but he was I grew up in France, so I knew of Henri Poincaré, and I studied math when I was in high school, and that was my thing. So I knew about him when I was probably like 14 years old. Mm-hmm. But he was one of the precursors of complexity theory, and he was trying to solve the n-body problem, among other things. And he figured out, he was one of the first people that figured out that there were some systems that were radically not predictable by simple equations, like the Newtonian laws of motion, and gravitational laws and all that. Mm-hmm. Those were very simple in a way. I mean, they, obviously it took a genius to come up with them, but once you knew them, the inverse square law is very simple. You can calculate orbit of a planet around, a sun or something to a great degree of accuracy with a very simple equation. But Poincaré started figuring out, there are some systems out there where there are no equations that can describe them, period. And now we know that in complex systems are precisely systems where the only way to know what's going to happen in the future is to actually iterate the steps, in a computer or something, and calculate each and every single instance separately. There is no general equation that you can just plug in the numbers and say, okay, at time t in the future, this will be the state of the system. There's no such thing. There's no algorithm to derive it. Same thing with the Mandelbrot set, like fractal geometry. It's very interesting stuff. But so that's kind of like complexity, but going instead of complexity going out, it's going inwards to the microscopic, and it's fascinating. But so there are systems that are completely unpredictable in that sense, and so these are the kinds of systems that interest me, and these are definitely the kinds of systems that apply to the study of the human world. In fact, with the human world, it's even worse than that, because you've got basic complex systems, like a double jointed pendulum is an example of. Have you ever seen one of these things move?
Yeah. They use it to draw.
Yeah, it's a very basic example of complexity, but it's in the complex world. It's very basic. It's it kind of sounds like a contradiction, but it's a simple complex system. It's still a complex system because it's very unpredictable. But then you have complex adaptive systems, and most of the time these days when people talk about complexity and complex system, they automatically include the fact that they're complex adaptive systems. So these are systems that can sort of adjust themselves depending on their environment and circumstances. And then I make a further distinction, a higher level of complexity, which is complex, adaptive, and self-referential systems, which obviously we are. And then you get into, Gödel's theorems and the Turing halting problem and undecidability problems and non-algorithmic problems and things like that are all very applicable to a study of the order of the human world. But because these cannot be reduced to simple laws like the inverse square law, or even Einstein's. I've studied physics at the graduate level, so I've studied tensor calculus and Einstein's field equations and things like that. And those are very complicated. But nevertheless, once you plug in the numbers to these equations, you come up with very definite numbers. And in fact, they're so definite that they've been corroborated by various observations and things like that to a very large, to a very high degree of precision. So so you plug in the numbers themselves, the equations themselves can be pretty complex, complicated, I should say, complex, in the usual sense of the word, but not in the complexity theory sense of the word. But when you plug in the numbers, you come up with a definite answer, and that's it. And you can plug in any number, in any initial conditions, you can come up with a future condition at time t plus x, in the future, and you can figure out, where the beam of light, or where the planet or where the star is going to be in the future. Now, of course, with quantum mechanics, a lot of that stuff, when we talked about this last time, but some of these concepts changed a little bit. But nevertheless, when we come to a study of the human order, then we are way beyond that. I mean, it's not that we can't understand it, but first of all, it takes a lot more effort, and it takes a lot more knowledge in very different areas. And like I said, to me, the relevant areas are complexity theory, emergence, as part of complexity theory of the theory of emergent systems. These are things that are being debated like right now, right? So we go back and say, a long time and say that there's this established consensus about this. These are theories that are still being debated today. There is some consensus in certain areas, but inside other areas, scientists are, they're at odds with each other. So, game theory is huge. There's huge advances in game theory that have shown why we do the things we do. I'm sure you've read, you seem to be a very well-read person, so in game theory about the tit-for-tat strategy, why people can't be like complete naive altruists versus complete egoists, and why in the prisoner's dilemma, I'm sure you've probably been, at least have at least some exposure to all these things, but they are
exposed to it, but I cannot remember it all the way you do.
Yeah, prisoner's dilemma. I don't want to get too much into it, but the fact that most people will tend to cooperate first with each other. I mean, there are people that are either psychopaths or sociopaths or other tendencies that are not necessarily pro-social that will not do that. But the average person, in general, if they've been brought up in the in the proper culture, that's very important, by the way. Part of it, maybe most of it, but at least part of it is cultural. Part of it is genetic. Kids are born with certain propensities that culture has to reinforce those things. But anyway, as adults, a well balanced and whether the average adult, probably the first thing they do is probably their default position is to trust people, particularly people that have been brought up in the same culture as they were. And so they will cooperate until such time as they have sort of a proof or an inkling that the other person is actually trying to play them for a sucker or something, right? And that happens. Some people will try to take advantage of others with no compunctions whatsoever. And so in game theory, actually, it turns out that, the best strategy if you want to maximize your the overall welfare of the group is when somebody, you first start, your default position is to cooperate with the other party. And so if they give you something, you give them something in return, and you keep doing this. And then if somebody defects, which is a technical term, and they actually don't reciprocate as you were expecting, then you do the same thing to them at the next step. It turns out that's actually the best strategy in game theory. That's pure mathematics. Pure mathematics explains a human behavior in a way that's absolutely incredible. And by the way, I'm very oversimplifying because there are a lot of variants on that strategy. There is a bunch of various tit-for-tat strategies that you can, variants of it that are even more sophisticated. But the fact that a theoretical mathematical model can actually be applied to how human interacts, to me, it tells me something. I mean, it's difficult, but we can explain a lot of stuff that, our ancestors would have had no idea about how to explain it. But they had no idea, but they knew how to deal with it. See, that's two different things. The concept that, of explicit knowledge, that's what I'm talking to you now. We can actually explicitly figure out why people cooperate first, and then, they'll retaliate if they figure out the situation is not in their favor and stuff like that. So we can actually explain it now explicitly. In the past, it wasn't always the case. But nevertheless, that knowledge was implicit in our culture. That's the way people acted. That's the way they were taught to act. That's the way their culture, their enculturation taught them this was the best way to deal with life, even though people could not explain it. But that's where cultural evolution comes in, right? People had to learn the hard way, but once that lesson is learned, it is then incorporated into our culture, and it is transmitted culturally from generation to generation. This is a very important concept to grasp. That's one thing. See, most people that are conservatives, to me, they understand the world far, far better than progressives do. But they can't explain why they understand it. They have this implicit knowledge of the world, but they only do because they trust that their parents and grandparents and their culture around them somehow knew something that was useful, right?
Well, they're also busy out there making a living, and they don't have time to march.
Right. Well, but even then, even none of us can understand completely without implicit. We always have to. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care, if you have a Nobel Prize. We all are completely dependent on implicit knowledge contained in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, okay, occasionally we can have glimpses and insights and explain retroactively why it is that it works that way. And in some cases, we can actually say, well, actually, some of the things that we do are not really adapted to our modern society because they were adaptive, let's say, in an ancestral environment, hunter-gatherer, cultural, small group, 200 people, 250 people. But then in the modern society where you have anonymous interactions and, millions of people, and it's very different, and you have all this technology, it's possible that sometimes some of our, adaptive cultural learnings might not be quite right. But nevertheless, my default position is most of it is still right. Like thou shalt not kill. I don't care how advanced your technology is, but that's still a pretty good premise, right? It's a pretty cultural value to hold. And I don't care if you're a Christian or you're religious or you're not. We can pretty much demonstrate scientifically that it's a pretty darn good value, right? So there's no need to, in this case, it's one of the more obvious examples that if we said, oh, it's okay to kill anybody you want anytime you want, it's pretty obvious society would decay very rapidly into complete chaos and disorder. So,
well,
it's a very obvious example, but there are a lot of other examples that are far from obvious.
What brings me a lot of comfort in all of this is that there's plenty of information out there still to be discovered.
Correct.
And that the question is a gift. Whatever the question is that we're working on at the moment is the gift that opens up to us all the new wonders of the future, right?
Right. But to me, the bigger lesson is that just because we can't explicitly come up with an explanation for something is no cause in itself for rejecting that thing, right? And I think there's a famous, I think it's G.K. Chesterton, the thing about, somebody, a conservative who is going, on a walk in the countryside and encounters a fence, so I guess the progressive would be, you know, why is this fence here? I can't figure out why the fence is here, so therefore I should destroy the fence. It doesn't serve any purpose because I don't know why it's there, so therefore it serves no purpose. The conservative will say, well, wait a second, before we destroy it, maybe we should find out why it's there in the first place, right? And that's the difference in mentality. You know, you can see it every day. You can see it every day. There's some people that if you cannot explicitly, you know, step by step, explain to them why it is that they should follow this rule, they'll say, well, in that case, that rules mean nothing, and I'm not going to follow it. So there. That's a very immature, very irresponsible, and very unscientific, and very irrational, by the way, very irrational, if you understand or reason properly. It's a very irrational way of reacting to the world. That's something that's I think is very deep and profound. You know, it's a worldview. It's a different way of seeing the world. But I think it's very, very important to draw that distinction. It's one of the things that drives my life and my philosophy. That's you know, I mean, the same thing. You know, the typical example is children are able to speak a language by the time they are 3 or even 2. You know, initially not very well, but they follow the rules of grammar very well. They'll make the occasional mistake, but by the time they're like 5, 6, or 7, they hardly ever make a mistake, grammatical mistake. Well, occasionally they will, you know, particularly when they start writing, you know, they might spell something wrong. But speaking it, instinctively, they are able to pick up rules that they have no understanding of. If you ask the 6-year-old who speaks perfect English or French or German, explain to me what rules you're following, you know, the rules of grammar. They have no idea. Of course, later on, they learn it in school. That's why we have to teach them. We do teach them retroactively. And I see it, it's the exact analogy. Our culture knows a lot of stuff that most of us have no idea how it got there. We don't know why it's there. We can't explain it. Now as it turns out, it seems like we can explain more and more and more of it recently. But just because we can't explain something is no reason for completely reject. No, again, just because you can go the other way too and be too conservative and say, well, if things have been that way for 1,000 years and they should stay that way forever, no, necessarily. There's no room for change. That's another extreme. That's not a good worldview. So there's a happy medium there.
Yeah, right. I mean, well, we already talked about the need for flexibility and revivifying the excessive order, and
too much rigidity will lead to death. You know, too much rigidity will lead to death of a society because you can't adapt to changing environments.
So let's wrap it up. And
yes, I know.
Yeah, the last thing I want to say is that the question is a gift. Do you have a last word?
No, I don't. I'll say what I think. What I just said. My last few statements there are last words for today because I think they are critical to understanding of how human culture and human society works, and that if you don't understand that, we're headed for trouble, big trouble, huge trouble. And I you know, that's what Jordan Peterson says this. So no, I had come to the same conclusion. He's a much better speaker than I am, and of course he's famous now. And by the way, since we're mentioning him, I hope he gets better very soon because of his recent events in his life. So, but so he's much better at explaining all that stuff than I am. But essentially, he's saying the same thing. So,
what he's given us all is a matrix through which we can explain these things and a way to talk about them. Right. Things that we sort of implicitly understood, but he's.
So I didn't learn this from him, but I was glad to see somebody that was able to put it in words that make sense to makes sense to a lot of people. So
yeah.
And of course, he says many other relevant things, but among other things, he does talk about this. So again, it was very nice talking to you. I hope we can.
Nice talking to you too. I'm eager to see the videos that you do with with
With
Adam.
Adam, yeah, I'm
Julia.
supposed to, right now I'm on the calendar to talk to Adam Friended of Think Club on the 3rd of October right now. Is the plan.
Okay, everybody, watch out for that one.
And yes, apparently we're supposed to talk about Jonathan Haidt's work quite a bit because he's a big fan, and I am too, but maybe not as quite as much as he is. So I guess that'll be maybe one of the big topics of conversation. Is there's Jonathan Haidt is a good point of departure for some very serious topics about rationality and intuition and what does what. So that's an area of interest to me.
Okay, well, it's good talking to you, Carl. Thank you so
Okay, all
much.
right, bye bye. Till next
Bye-bye.
time.